Hi, my name is Sandro Ganawella. Welcome back to the Burn Bag podcast. We've had a little bit of a hiatus, but we're going to be making some new changes, sort of going back to basics. From here on out, I'll be your sole host on the Burn Bag. We're also bringing back our old series, What in the World? You may recall that I used to do this series with Ryan Rosenthal, who was my co-founder and then co-host before he went on to bigger and better things, where we basically broke down in about half an hour to 45 minutes what's been going on in current events across the world and sort of just talking to each other as young professionals, young guys who want to work in the foreign policy field, in the national security field. So, well, you may be asking me, well, how can you do this without any Ryan, without any other co-host? Well, we'll be bringing on other young professionals every so often who have lived, who have experienced, and who may be working on some of these key issues, who can really talk about this stuff in a very casual and a conversational manner. Oftentimes these folks may be my friends. These folks may be people I meet just throughout life, and so on. But the first of these episodes on our return will be with Gabriela Saade as we sort of break down what's been going on in Venezuela. You've been hearing a lot about the 2024 Venezuelan presidential elections, the alleged electoral fraud, and Maduro's attempts to sustain power, and all of these protests that have been going on. So I really appreciate Gabby for coming on the program. We went to the University of Chicago together in grad school. She's great, and I really hope you enjoy our conversation. And we're going to be bringing you many more great conversations, both these young professionals, but also, of course, those senior level guests that we've had on the regular series. But for now, here's our first episode of What in the World as we are back. Thank you. Hi, my name is Sandro Ganawella. Welcome back to the Burn Bags What in the World series. This is the first time we're doing a What in the World episode in I think around 2 years, but I'm bringing it back. There are some other changes in the Burn Bag that I'll be announcing shortly, but we're going to be talking about some key events in the news. Today's episode is primarily going to be focusing on the chaos around Venezuela's 2024 presidential elections. I believe Nicolas Maduro, he lost the elections, according to very many people. He's trying to essentially say he didn't lose the elections. There have been a lot of protests that have been going on, a lot of arrests that have been made, and it's getting a lot of coverage. And I wanted to bring on one of my old friends from my time at the University of Chicago when I was at grad school there, Gabriela Saade. Gabby used to do research for the National Assembly in Venezuela for their representatives in the mid-2010s. She co-founded a nonprofit that provided humanitarian assistance to people in disaffected socioeconomic areas in Venezuela, and her experiences as a social entrepreneur have been featured on NPR, CNN, MIT News, and the World Economic Forum's Davos Summit in her role as a shaper of the Caracas hub of the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers community. Gabby, it's really great to talk to you. I think for the first time in a couple of years. I think we're still in touch on social media, but I
Yeah,
mean, it's
yeah, yes.
good to hear your voice.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you're kicking off this what's happening in the world section with Venezuela
Yeah,
and with me, of course.
yeah. Thanks for being the first guest back.
Yes.
So, Gabby, essentially, I mean, what is happening in Venezuela? I try to provide a primer, but what's been going on with with the recent elections? Can you sort of set the stage for, set the scene for what's been going on?
Of course, yes. So for those who don't know, basically the incumbent Nicolas Maduro became the president of Venezuela in April 19 of 2013, following the death of his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. So I remember like those presidential elections, we were so hopeful that the opposition candidate, Enrique Capriles, was going to win. There was a very small gap between Capriles and Maduro, but at the time, the opposition, when I say we didn't have like the evidence to prove that we had won those elections. The government didn't want to audit those elections, but they did have like some substantial evidence to claim that they won. So Maduro became president, and ever since he started his presidency, the situation in Venezuela has gone so bad for most Venezuelans. Like the situation worsened really bad, mostly because of economic mismanagement, political persecution also um, was its worst with the Maduro presidency. So those are two things to really like highlight from his presidency. So after 2014, so a year after he won the elections, the humanitarian situation in Venezuela started to get out of control. There was this humanitarian emergency in the country, which is when I decided to create the nonprofit. And then years later, so the terms in Venezuela were changed from 5 years to 6 years. So after that election, we had elections again in 2018. But at the time, the opposition decided not to participate because they banned the opposition candidates. The elections weren't going to be observed by international parties. And basically, the opposition at the time decided not to participate. But this time, 6 years later, 2024, we have elections again. And we had a very strong candidate, Maria Corina Machado. The government banned her from running. She's like the main opposition leader now. And she had a surrogate named Edmundo Gonzalez. And Maria Corina, she built a platform and she basically capitalized on the migration crisis in Venezuela. 7 million Venezuelans are living abroad, including myself, as a result of this humanitarian crisis and just the economic situation in the country. But this time, what happened is that the opposition got 90,000 witnesses in the electoral centers. And we had enough evidence this time to prove that the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, won the elections. So the elections happened a week ago. And yes, the opposition had witnesses all over the country. So when the National Electoral Center basically proclaimed Maduro as president, everyone was like, no, this is not true. Look at this. We have something called electoral tallies. I can explain that in a little bit, but basically what happened is that the National Electoral Center declared Maduro as winner, someone that we've had in power for 11 years now. People are very upset about it, very frustrated. And in the last week, close to 1,000 people have been imprisoned by the government just to protest or just because they, I don't know, provided some sort of service to the opposition candidates or they work for an NGO. So the situation is really, really bad. We also have official data says that 20 people have been killed by the government. So what happened is people took to the streets to protest after the National Electoral Center declared Maduro as winner. But we know that's not true because we have access to the electoral tallies. Anyone can go to this website to check this out. And we also have like anecdotal evidence. And we saw what happened in Venezuela. We saw everyone just voting for Edmundo Gonzalez. So it's very frustrating to have our national institutions declaring Maduro as winner.
Yeah, and I mean, in addition to, I mean, so many of the domestic observers on the ground, we've had a lot of international organizations also call these results essentially fraudulent. I think, Gabby, I was reading the exit polls, I believe, on the day of the election. Was it like something like he was losing? I mean, the opposition candidate, Mr. Gonzalez, was getting around like 69, 70% of the vote?
Yes. Yeah, so basically those are the numbers. So according to the National Electoral Center, Maduro won with 51% of the votes. And
Exactly 51%,
yes.
just like a bare majority.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
gee.
yeah. No, no, totally. And then they said that sorry, Edmundo Gonzalez had only 44% of the votes. And then for the other candidates, they assigned 4.6% to each candidate. So it didn't even add up to 100%.
More than 100.
Yes. Then as we were looking the numbers closely, we realized that the decimal, so after the first decimal, all the decimals were zeros. If you use the numbers that they had, which is like almost impossible. To, for it to actually happen. And then in contrast, with 80% of the electoral tallies, the opposition claimed that Edmundo Gonzalez was actually the winner. And the key thing in this election is the electoral tallies, because an electoral tally is basically kind of like a receipt when you purchase something. um you get a receipt for your credit card, whatever, and that receipt, like, you cannot edit that receipt. It's unique, it has a unique code, and that's exactly what happens with an electoral tally. When you cast your vote in Venezuela, you do it electronically, so the National Electoral Center gets that vote electronically, but then you back it up with a receipt that the voter gets. You have to put that receipt inside of a box. And then at the end of the process, in each center, the machine prints this electoral tally that basically counts all the votes for each candidate. So the opposition has 80% of those electoral tallies. And what they did is they had witnesses all over the country scanning those electoral tallies, and then a group of people transcribed those electoral tallies into a system so that anyone can access this. And they did this in less than 24 hours. So something that the National Electoral Center definitely has the ability to do, but they said, no, we are not going to publish these results because we got hacked from opposition paid opposition supporters in Northern Macedonia, which doesn't make any sense.
Northern Macedonia, that's a little bit away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's actually like really funny memes about it. Like what? And yeah, so they basically yeah, they haven't published the electoral tallies, and that is what voters are demanding from them, because how can you claim that you win elections and voters don't even have access to the data? Then that's what we want to see. We want to see the data disaggregated by electoral center. We have the technology to do that. The opposition already did that with 80% of the electoral tallies, and they haven't done it. And not with 100%. The opposition had the ability to do it with, covering like the whole universe. But in many centers, witnesses and just volunteers were kicked out by government supporters. In some others, the National Electoral Center had staff deployed in those centers, and they didn't want to share those electoral tallies with voters, which is something that is illegal in Venezuela. That process of printing the electoral tallies and basically closing the whole process is a public process. Like, any citizen can go and observe that process, but in many centers,
Gee, so
that couldn't be done.
so many things to dissect from there. So first of all, the
Sorry.
percentages of the candidates, right? So you add all of those percentages of the candidates, right? Like say in like 2020, Biden won like what, 50%, Trump won like 46%, and then the other candidates won like 4%, right? So you have all of that, it adds up to 100. So these folks didn't even think to make sure it actually even like numerically checks out in terms of proportions, which is just, I mean, that just seems
Yes.
obscene.
Wild.
That just seems obscene, but also almost like a hey, like we can do this and you can't do anything about it. And I'm just sort of curious, right? Like, I mean, the last couple of elections, right? So like this time around, you said you had 90,000 observers. There was a lot of evidence that was being actively gathered about this electoral fraud. Uh, how did the government react to the last sort of two elections? What did Maduro do to sort of cement his power, and what were the reactions from the people, in those first two?
Okay, so when Maduro won in 2013, something very important to highlight is that the government, literally until Maduro became president, the government of Venezuela had so much money because of oil revenue. Like, it was wild. Every time we had elections, the public expenditure would just blow up. Like, it was insane. So they had a very strong base and they did have many votes. Like they had a lot of support from a very strong base that they built thanks to that public expenditure. So Chavez died in 2012 and he had a very strong base. He was a very charismatic and popular president.
Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez.
Hugo Chavez, exactly. So he died, and then officially in 2013, and I say officially because there are so many like conspiracy theories, like we actually like don't know exactly what happened, but the world knew about it in March of 2013, and then in April we have the elections, and Maduro had been handpicked by Chavez to become his successor, and he did have at the time like a lot of support because Chavez was this very popular and charismatic leader. So in 2013, there was a very strong base for the government. The opposition also had a lot of people. We didn't have the exodus that we have now. There was a lot of discontent at the government. But the gap between Maduro and Capriles, or the opposition candidate at the time, was very, very small, was very small. And at the time, we didn't have like the evidence to basically claim that the elections have been fraudulent. There was a lot of, I was on the streets that day. I was taking photos. I was reporting on what was happening on the ground. And I know I saw it myself that many clauses of the electoral law were, basically not follow. The government was basically forcing some people to vote for the government. They were threatening people. So they had this, whole system where they had a lot of people depending on the government, and they were threatened, like, okay, if you don't vote for me, then you're not going to receive this benefit, things like that. So they did win, but again, I feel like honestly, we won't know exactly what happened. We won't know exactly what the numbers were.
There's still some skepticism.
Yes, we don't have the evidence, but again, the gap was like very small. So it was going to be very tough to prove that the opposition candidate won because the government still had a very strong base. Then in the next elections, in 2018, the opposition decided not to participate because like the strategy was just to boycott those elections. People were just tired. The year prior, 2017, we had been protesting for months. 100 Venezuelans were killed, close to 100 Venezuelans were killed in those protests. It was a very tough year, and people were just burned out. The opposition didn't have a strategy, didn't have a candidate, so they just decided to boycott those elections. So they happened, but no one really like honestly accepted Maduro as president. And then in January of 2019, he was supposed to be like officially named president by the National Assembly, but people in Venezuela were like, no, these elections like they weren't transparent, they weren't free elections, they didn't allow us to have a candidate. That's why we boycotted the elections. So Maduro is not really our president. Who chose Maduro? Like this is not the true will of the Venezuelan people. So this is when, and I don't know if you recall this, in January of 2019, the president of the National Assembly at the time, who was an opposition leader, Juan Guaido,
Juan Guaido, yes.
yes, he became basically like, at least on paper, like the president of Venezuela, according to the opposition. He was the rightful president because Maduro was basically usurping power since those elections were invalid. So a few countries recognize Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela, and they were demanding the government to actually have free elections like the Constitution says. But that strategy didn't work. Sanctions were put in place. The government found other sources of income and other ways of basically keeping themselves in power. They gave a lot of well, we call it like loyalty. Like they were buying like loyalties. They were bribing a lot of
Oh,
groups.
bribery, yeah.
Yes, in Venezuela. So they have the military, but they also have like paramilitary groups in Venezuela, and they also have criminal groups operating in the country, and all of them basically support the government. And that was like the strategy that they had. They were like, okay, we don't have international recognition by a number of countries. We have sanctions. Well, let's just create our own like our own system, and let's make sure that we are protected here, and that no one is going to be able to take power away from us. So all these armed groups in Venezuela, they started to support Maduro. They started to be like, okay, you can control this area, you can control this other area in the country, and that's how basically he started to cement his power. And then 6 years later, now we have these elections, but the opposition had a different strategy. Why? Because the discontent is so big that even with 7 million Venezuelans overseas, the opposition knew that the gap was going to be so wide that this time they weren't going to be able to do any strategy to win the elections, and that's what's happened.
So you mentioned some of these groups, who Maduro has sort of bought off through bribery and sort of just paying them off. So like, I mean, are we talking about like both like military, paramilitary, and gangs as well? Like sort of like violent lawless groups who are sort of like supporting Maduro? Like, I mean, say like, is it sort of the example of like, you try to speak out, you're being an activist against the government, and this gang's gonna get you, basically. Like you're gonna be disappeared. Is that sort of what has been happening under Maduro?
Well, so what's been happening, it's a lot of things. So, on one hand, you have these groups called colectivos. These are armed groups that control areas in the country, mostly low income areas, what are known as barrios. And whenever there's any opposition to the government, any organic protests that happen in those barrios, then these colectivos, they take to the streets, and they try to basically like stop people from doing that. They attack people. Sometimes they use their firearms to do this. So they're very violent groups. So we have colectivos, right? And they run these different places, and they were armed and supported by the government. You also have the military per se, and different police arms in the government. So you have the military, our national armed forces, who are also with the government because they have received insane benefits in the context of a horrible humanitarian crisis. They have incredible salaries, incredible benefits, and that's why they support the government. Then they have these other like intelligence groups. So there's one called Sevin, another one called the Hesim, and those police groups, they also like try to well, since the after the elections, they have been tracking people. They have been stopping people on the street when they're protesting, taking them to go to prison and that kind of thing. So you have all these different groups doing different things, but in general, they're all supporting Maduro, and they're trying to stop people from protesting and taking to the streets. Before these elections, what these groups would do would be similar, but it was more like intelligence focused. Sometimes the government, whenever they want to blame something that's happening in the country, yeah, they want to blame like an opposition actor or like NGOs or this or that. These groups would like target very specific actors, very specific people, and then they would take them as political prisoners. But now, after the elections, anyone who's protesting, it's been followed, and it's been a victim of this government apparatus. In fact, I have friends who were telling me on WhatsApp that the police now, there's if they stop you on the street, like, I don't know, you are in your car and then you get stopped by the police, they now have apparently like the power to even check your social media. And if they find anything that can put you in trouble because they, according to them, you are inciting terrorism, or you are inciting hatred, then they have the power to take you and then ask questions and like detain you. So it's very, very scary what's happening, because now anyone, it's it's a target.
So freedom of expression certainly out the window. Political life is sort of out the window, very restricted unless you're a supporter of the government. I mean, what's life like in Venezuela right now? You mentioned 7 million Venezuelans, including yourself, who are living outside of the country. You mentioned this just severe humanitarian crisis that started in the early 2010s, and I believe it's getting significantly worse and worse and worse, just this economic crisis. So, I mean, what is life like in Venezuela today for just the average person?
Yes, so actually I was in Venezuela in December and I was in Venezuela recently in July. I left right away because I mean, I didn't know, but I I was afraid that something was going to happen and that maybe I wasn't going to be able to leave the country after the elections. So, and I have a lot of family in Venezuela. So that to say that I know pretty well what's happening in Venezuela. I know the situation, like I live there, my family's there.
You
And
see it.
yeah. I see it and I have lived it. And um, so every region in Venezuela feels different. The capital city, Caracas, it's definitely better off compared to like other parts of the country because basically the government decided to provide certain public goods only to the capital city. A lot of people who live in other states outside of where the capital is, they don't have electricity for 8 hours a day, sometimes 12 hours a day. Um, Professors earn $10 a month. I have an uncle, he's a university professor. He saved all his money. He was contributing to Social Security, and now basically his money is worth nothing because he contributed to his Social Security in bolívares. And now what he gets from his Social Security is $4 a month. He works at public university, yes, for $10 a month in a country where you need at least $1,000 a month to live to cover all your needs. Most people in Venezuela are in that position. I don't remember exactly what the latest data point was, but at some point we had 90% of poverty rate. Like it was insane. Um, you have a lot of people on the street just trying to get by. Many people always considering leaving the country. You have farewell parties all the time because younger people, they leave the country because there are no opportunities. But in the last 2 years, the situation was getting a little bit better, um, or maybe not better, but at least um, less frustrating and like uh I know the word in Spanish, but like a little bit better, a little bit more livable because more people had access to US dollars and our economy is now dollarized. Like we had a de facto dollarization. So everything you buy on the street, the reference price is dollars. So because the government basically decided to embrace this, which is pretty cynical. Like I think it's pretty ironic, sorry, that what is helping Venezuela is like all the money, all the US dollars that are getting into the economy from people who are abroad and they're sending back money to their families, or just people in the past you couldn't pay with dollars, it was illegal, and now the government basically decided to decriminalize that and you can use dollars in Venezuela, and that made the situation a little bit better since you can protect your savings and you have some sort of like purchasing power. So that said, the situation is honestly like not good. The infrastructure is crumbling. You see so many abandoned homes in Venezuela in the most beautiful neighborhoods. Families are separated. You go to a house and you see all the empty chairs from the families who used to be there. And now you only have a few family members there. A lot of kids are out of school. They are forced to work. They don't have their parents in the country. They have left in order to be able to provide for them. So it's a very delicate situation for Venezuelans. And this is why most Venezuelans decided to support Edmundo Gonzalez.
I mean, that almost sounds like, and I hate to use the word, but that the economy is just decaying to an extent. I mean, you mentioned that those visuals of the empty chairs around those tables, these, lovely homes that are now sort of in deterioration. I mean, it's just shocking to, I mean, you lived it, you experienced it, you grew up in it, and you lived through many of your formative years, in that type of situation. Uh, I think there are like a lot of weird people on social media these days, making all of these
Yeah.
arguments and whatnot. What are the biggest misconceptions that you're personally seeing, on your feeds, on your socials, maybe even in the media about, what's going on right now in Venezuela with the election, with the government, about Maduro, etc.?
I think two main things. A big one, a very big one, is that the economic crisis in Venezuela was caused by US sanctions. And unfortunately, as you said, like I have been in NPR. I was a guest there recently. I went to the Indicator podcast, and I was talking about the situation in Venezuela. And yes, sanctions definitely don't help. But at the same time, it's not like they made things worse, I would say. In fact,
Not the
some
ignition.
yes, something very interesting happened in Venezuela when sanctions were put in place. Well, first of all, sanctions initially targeted only individuals in the government, and then they started targeting certain government um, entities. But then because Venezuela and the US, they, broke diplomatic relations, then that's when the situation between Venezuela and the US started to get worse. You cannot travel to Venezuela directly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason I was bringing back NPR is because I was talking about the situation in Venezuela, and when I heard back the episode, they did emphasize a lot the U.S. sanctions as part of like the reason why the economy is the way it is. And yes, it definitely affects the economy, but the worst years of our economy happened prior to those sanctions being in place. So those sanctions started in 2019. Our humanitarian crisis started officially in 2014, which is why in 2015 I created this nonprofit. The worst years that I remember in Venezuela were 2017, 2018, and 2019. So our country was already heading into an economic disaster prior to US sanctions. Yes, maybe sanctions didn't help, but it's not, I don't even think it's relevant to, when you talk about our crisis, to bring up the US sanctions. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that the opposition is this far right movement that we are, I don't know, funded by the CIA. I still speak in first person, even though I no longer work with the opposition, but I mean, I identify myself with opposition. And honestly, I don't even know, I don't even think that we should label the opposition as the opposition because it's like most of the country, but that's another discussion. But basically, this whole speech, especially from some leftist organizations, that Maria Corina Machado, she's a Zionist, and then she is backed by the CIA.
What does that got to do with like what does that got? That's a totally different conflict.
I know, exactly. And it's wild because it's like, what? Like when you see the videos of the protesters, when you see where the electoral centers when the where the opposition won, those were traditionally areas that were very supportive or of Chavez and of this government, but now they are in such a bad situation that now they have decided to go with an alternative. And when you see those videos, when you see
Common sense.
yeah, exactly. And when you see the videos of all like migrants leaving Venezuela and walking through the jungle, through the Darien to find a better life overseas, like those people, like they come from, like literally the barrios, very poor communities, very areas that you would never think of, you know, it would be wild for them if they knew that they're being labeled as this like CIA backed opposition, or they're getting paid by the US. Like that's wild. So I think those two are like the main misconceptions. I also saw some TikTok videos of what looked like news channels declaring Maduro as winner. So I think there's also a lot of like misinformation in social media, probably like AI generated misinformation. Um, but yeah, but that's another topic as
Yeah, I
well.
mean, that's just crazy because I'm glad I really brought you on because you've lived it, you've experienced it, you've walked those streets, like literally walked those streets and seen,
Yeah.
what's been happening in the country. Uh, and it's just crazy to see that people are just like outwardly denying this. People who are sitting in their little armchairs, in their like nice apartments and all of that. Uh, who are just trying to deny that this is actually occurring, like actively denying it, and
Yeah.
it's very alarming, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes what you have is just the situation just not being covered at all, or a lot of people don't even know what's happening. Like they know that there's some fraud claims about the elections, but people are not really, I mean, when I say people, I mean like people in the US don't really know what's going on. And this is something that directly affects the US, like the migration crisis at the border. Like there were unprecedented numbers of Venezuelans crossing the border. There's this whole narrative about immigrants from Venezuela, and also this is a very hot topic for the elections. And if this situation doesn't change, according to some polls, 5 to 7 million Venezuelans are going to leave the country. They have the intention to leave, and they were just waiting for a political change. And if that happens, we're just like Venezuelans are just going to disrupt so many systems in the region, which is why I think a lot of presidents and some countries in the region have come up and they have tried to work, as mediators in this conflict. Um, but yeah, sometimes it's surprising not to see this as something, relevant for some media outlets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think with migration, I mean, that sheer number of people, I mean, that's going to put a lot of pressure on a lot of government institutions, a lot of government mechanisms, and a lot of the surrounding countries in Latin America, and so on. And I mean, these people just don't have anywhere else to go, though. That's the problem, right? Because, I mean, they can't. I mean, even like so many people working so hard to make ends meet. And as you said about your relative, the value of the money has just diminished so much that you may be making $4 a month, $10 a month, in a country where you need about $1,000 a month to actually survive and to just meet your basic needs.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that again, I feel like it's really hard to explain the extent of the crisis, especially because people in Venezuela had a totally different life. Like my grandparents, my dad's family, they're from Lebanon. They migrated to Venezuela in the 50s because it was a very prosperous country. We didn't know what migrating was. Like we weren't necessarily a country that was exporting people. On the contrary, we were receiving so many immigrants from so many places of the world. And now we are in this situation and we are learning to become a diaspora. And it's wild because when you see these numbers, it's typically like typically these kind of numbers in an exodus mean that there's an armed conflict in the country, there's war, something like that. And this is just an economic crisis, economic and political crisis that has taken us to this situation. So I don't think there's anything similar that's happening currently in the world, and definitely not in Latin America's recent history.
I mean, it's absolutely shocking and devastating to hear about just the extent of this economic crisis and now this political crisis. Well, this ongoing political crisis that's really just intensified. But Gabby, as we sort of close out this conversation, do you have sort of any last thoughts that you sort of want to leave our audience with, both, the general audience members, but also those folks, say, who are working on foreign policy issues, on international economics, on international politics, etc.
Well, I would just say that this situation, this is not only a Venezuela problem, this is a problem for the Americas as a whole. Um, what happened in Venezuela was an evident fraud in the presidential elections. If anyone has doubts, they can just check out the website that was created by our opposition leader. They can check out all the electoral tallies. And if they don't believe that, then you can just request the government to publish those actas, those electoral tallies, because there's a
Well,
reason.
it's like, what's there to hide?
Exactly. This is what we're saying. Okay, you are the winner. Just show the evidence, just show the actas, show the electoral tallies. You say like this is going to give you so much legitimacy. What do you need to hide? But instead, they are creating this whole narrative about Macedonia del Norte. And the most concerning thing to me now is that anyone is now a target in Venezuela. I have friends who haven't talked to me in days. They're hiding, they're scared. I have other friends who work in NGOs providing humanitarian assistance in the country. And they were supposed to, I don't know, fly to Geneva to a conference. Literally, this happened this week, a human rights conference, and they were stopped at the airport. Their passports invalidated and they were detained for hours. And this is happening to any Venezuela who is tied to NGOs, who is tied to, I don't know, communications. I fear for our journalists on the ground as well. Like I said, no one is safe in Venezuela at the time if you are opposing the government. And protesting is not against the law. Anyone can protest in Venezuela. Our protests are peaceful. We are not violent people. We are not armed. We are not creating, any chaos or disruptions. We are just demanding for Edmundo Gonzalez, our rightful president, who we voted for last Sunday, to be recognized as the winner. So I think this is the main message, but also not to forget that we are dealing with very dangerous people. The Venezuelan government, they have shown their true colors this past week with all the repression, with all the narrative. Um, so I don't know. I'm genuinely scared. I don't know what's gonna happen, but I do know that we won those elections. We have the evidence, and we have, I hope, the international community with us because, like I said, this is a problem that transcends Venezuela now.
Definitely. And I mean, we'll be seeing, what's going to be happening in the days that are to come. We'll be releasing this on Monday morning. So, I mean, who knows, right? What's going to happen overnight? Who knows what'll happen by the time, you, our listeners, actually listen to this episode. But do please track this. It's a very important issue to track among, much of what's going on in the world. But I think this in particular, in Latin America is significant because it'll have an effect on many of the surrounding countries, on the United States. And it's just important because, I mean, the sheer numbers of people who are being affected by this, have left the country already, who are trying to leave the country because there is really no other avenue, there is no other option. It's just massive. So, Gabby, thanks so much for joining me here today. It's great to hear your voice again after a couple of years at UChicago. You were certainly one of the more talented classmates I had at UChicago. So, it's always,
Likewise.
yeah,
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for covering this topic. It's honestly an honor to be here to talk about this. And yeah, we'll see what happens.
definitely, definitely. Thank you, Gabby.